Imagine settling in for a relaxing audiobook, either on a long drive, with your feet up by the lake, or just before you fall asleep, only to discover the calm, steady voice guiding you through the story belongs to a man who murdered 6 people and multiple members of his own family. That's not the setup for a new A24 movie, it's a real thing. And that audiobook narrator is Ed Kemper, also known as the co-ed killer. He's a 6'9" sociopath who became one of the most prolific audiobook narrators in the California prison system. Before true crime podcasts, before he was a character on the Netflix series Mindhunter, Kemper was sitting in a tiny recording booth studio behind prison walls, recording novels, textbooks, and even children's books, with a level of professionalism that shocked everyone who heard him. Even more disturbing, he he recorded for years before any of his listeners even knew who he was. And all of his listeners were blind. Today, we're diving into how a serial killer with one of the most dark and twisted histories in America became the voice behind hundreds of audiobooks for the visually impaired, and why his narration was considered so good that volunteers kept requesting him by name. This is Ed Kemper's disturbing audiobook career, The Serial Killer Who Became a Narrator. Don't forget, research is optional, but important. Let's get into it.
Positive things, like working in the Blind Project, where we read books onto tape for the blind.
In retrospect, this unique situation is upsetting on many accounts, but how it came to light and when people started really noticing this about Kemper was in a 1987 article in the Los Angeles Times. And it's surprisingly nice. The tone of the article follows a blind couple from New York. One's an anthropology professor and one is another kind of academic, I believe. They're a blind couple about to get married, and they've been listening to books from Ed Kemper for years, and they fly across the country to the mental facility where he's imprisoned and I believe still currently imprisoned, um, to visit him and the other prisoners and express their great thanks. Dr. Eames, the man in the couple, is an anthropology professor who had published multiple tomes on the subject and was a staunch death penalty advocate, said, quote, "Despite those awful crimes they've committed, those fellows are doing something positive for their fellow man. For that, they've got to be complimented." In the story, run by, it's not a puff piece, it's a little bit long, talks in detail about what was called the Blind Project. This was a combination effort between the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation and the local Vacaville Volunteers, which was a nonprofit. Their goal was to provide reading and supplementary materials to visually impaired and blind people across the country. For a small fee, a minimum of $3 per year and a maximum of 20, blind patrons or customers could send in materials and request that they be transcribed into Braille or recorded in an audiobook format. Now, this was the era where audiobooks were not very common and they were very, very expensive, prohibitively expensive. So books would have been on tape at this point. This was in the late 70s, and Kemper did it all the way into the early 2000s.
Now, just to give you a point of reference, this is Stephen King's best-selling novel, The Dead Zone. This is also Stephen King's novel, The Dead Zone. There are 15 hours of tape here, which...
But it really is, takes on an extra scary premise when you realize it's these murderers and criminals reading novels to people who don't know any better or who have a choice, I guess. The article actually quotes Kemper, who says, "Their visit here is so special for us. We get letters of thanks from our blind patrons, but they never come inside the prison to meet us." He's described as Edmund E. Kemper III, 38, the inmate who runs the program. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting into who Ed Kemper is because all the information is out there and we don't want to feed the grist mill anymore. But he's a person who is currently convicted and imprisoned for murdering 8 people. And as a young man, he murdered his grandparents and spent 5 years in a um, a mental health facility until he was deemed, fit to return to society. Bad call, authorities. Um, the point is, this story just really fascinates me, especially the LA Times article. Now, since then, it's become more kind of a legend, and people know, and it's been covered with a little bit more perspective. But it's just fascinating to me that all they could kind of focus on was what a good thing they were doing for the community, when in reality, an audiobook narrator has a lot in common with a serial killer like Ed Kemper. Kemper was known for having these deluded, psychotic fantasies of power and control, going particularly after young women who he deemed were too uppity or snooty for him. And since he was an outsider, this was his means of control. Well, if you think about it, this is almost giving Ed Kemper power, allowing him to use his booming baritone voice in this intimate scenario where it's almost as if his lips are whispering against his reader's ears. And it's really, really troubling. I don't know what else to say. Here's a clip of Kemper talking about it that will hopefully better articulate my point.
What have you gotten out of this whole program?
Well, I've learned that from the needs of the people that send us requests for reading, if I read what's put in front of me, if I read what's needed for those clients, I'm being exposed to materials that I wouldn't have chosen for myself, a much wider base of experience in print and in pictures that I think enriches my life. It gives it a lot more meaning.
Creepy, right? Now, while I would say from a moral standpoint, it's hard to argue that this was a good thing that visually impaired and blind people were getting access to these materials they wouldn't otherwise have, especially during the 70s, 80s, and 90s when accessibility was a hope and a prayer, and wasn't nearly what it is today, even though today still we still have leaps and bounds to go. The the interrelationship between this person who took so many people's lives, whose victims and victims' families are still coping with this every day, even now, 30, 40, 50 years later, um, it really draws some interesting ethical concerns. And I'm curious if there's any program like this still going on, particularly with people whose crimes were at the level of Kemper's. Again, of course, with your average um, non-violent, non-felonious serial killers, I wouldn't really have a problem with it. But particularly Kemper, I mean, this would be equivalent to finding out that Jeffrey Dahmer was writing recipes for cookbooks, or something to that effect, or that the Zodiac killer was writing the horoscopes in the New York Times. Again, I guess it's a slippery slope to equivocate there, but again, here's a clip.
Dozens of inmates who have donated thousands of hours in the recording booth. The day we visited, mass murderer Ed Kemper, who is serving a life sentence for 8 murders in the highly publicized Santa Cruz slayings, was transcribing Star Wars.
Reaching for the internal controls, 3PO was shocked. "Behave yourself, R2," he finally chastised his companion. "You're going to get us into trouble."
Need I say more? In Mindhunter, and there's record of the actual encounter, Kemper was known for being very manipulative and controlling, and it's almost like he was doing this not only one, I mean, he was getting the money, he was probably treated pretty well in prison for being a good boy volunteer, but you have to think there was some element of control and sort of being in power of a universe that he liked. And also, I guess for me, it kind of goes without saying, but maybe he was just doing it to try to get paroled early, because he's technically eligible for parole even now. It's been denied multiple times, and he's had a stroke, and he's decrepit at this point, and he's not looking too good. Um, that being said, he still did good work. I mean, he had this booming baritone voice. It wasn't nearly as deep, and in some of the videos you'll see, sometimes in videos to maximize the creepy effect, YouTubers or bloggers or whatever will like distort his voice so it sounds more like this. But he just has kind of a baritone voice, and he's a big guy. And he comes off as fairly intelligent, but beneath the surface is a monster. So I think there's only I can only find a list of about 17 titles formally that he recorded, but there are some records that he's done. He did over 5,000 hours in the studio, so he could have potentially recorded hundreds and hundreds of books. Some of the titles he covered or recorded include the Star Wars trilogy by George Lucas, the Rosary Murders by William Kinsey, the Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews, Web Between the Worlds by Charles Sheffield, Sidney Sheldon book, the fourth Dune book, God Emperor of Dune, about a power-hungry Atreides descendant who has merged with the giant sandworm and is, committing mass genocide. So I'm sure he enjoyed reading about that. Then there's another Sidney Sheldon, another V.C. Andrews, two books by Marilyn Harris, they were just kind of romance novels, which is the only ones that are kind of out of sort. He recorded Glass Key by Dashiell Hammett, which is one of my favorite noir novels. Tangled Web by Giles Lutz, Ellis Island by F. Stewart, and Beaudry's Law by Louis L'Amour, classic Western, about a 44 slinging cowboy seeking vengeance. Merlin's Mirror by Andre Norton, a fantasy novel. And finally, as he mentions in the clip earlier, several novels by E.B. White. Let you sit with that for a second. Needless to say, whatever your opinions on audiobooks, I love them personally. I think we can all agree that maybe giving someone this much access into people's ears and potentially minds, especially someone with this twisted of a history, probably wasn't the best idea, although it makes for a fascinating historical story. And again, I was almost reluctant to make this video because it almost humanizes Kemper, but if you look carelessly, if you don't really pay attention, it can make him seem like, oh, he saw good and he was trying to do better. And I think if you look closely, it's quite clear that it was just another angle for him to live out fantasies and have an element of control while making a fairly large salary, considering he was in prison.
Personally gotten any feedback from any
Yes,
clients?
I have some very satisfying comments from clients, and the more work someone like myself puts into that work for the student, or the professional person, or the entertainment reading person, the more that enriches their lives, the more it enables that person to do something with their potential. And that has been conveyed where we've done that successfully, and that's very, very satisfying.
It's important when we talk about these killers, these monsters, to remember that the victims' families and any potential victims, that are still alive are still out there and still coping with this. And there are victims of violence across the globe who deserve better than for us to admire or put these people on pedestals. So, of course, I'll let you do with that what you will. And don't forget, next time you're listening to an audiobook, maybe pull up the credits and check who the narrator is. Don't forget, research is optional, but important. Thanks.